Welcome everyone to the Defending and Advancing Climate Justice Policies webinar. My name is Taylor Ward. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Senior Manager of Communications and Education at Just Solutions. I am calling in from Yucat's land, also known as Fresno, California. Just Solutions is a national organization that drives innovative, equitable solutions to the climate crisis in support of healthy, resilient communities and accountable democratic institutions. We ground our work in the broader movement for environmental justice and the guiding principle that communities most harmed by climate change should lead in creating and implementing solutions. Please feel free to use the chat to add your name, your organization, and where you're located so everyone can know who else is on the call with us today. Just Solutions acknowledges that we occupy the stolen land of Turtle Island, home to countless Native tribes and nations. We recognize the ongoing struggles and violence Indigenous communities face and honor Indigenous knowledge, wisdom, and activism. We are committed to supporting justice for Indigenous communities by reflecting this conviction in our work. You can check out native-land.ca to find out whose land you're on and find more tools to support Native advocacy in your area. In today's webinar, we will be exploring the potential threats facing climate justice policies and campaigns and the actionable steps we can take to counter them. This session will provide a detailed overview of our forthcoming report, Defending and Advancing Climate Justice Policies. We're going to review key federal and state policy recommendations, focusing on transformative opportunities to defend against climate injustice, repair historical inequities, and advance bold, equitable solutions for a just future. You can see our agenda here for today. We're going to start with an overview of this project. We'll go into a deep dive on the report, discuss some upcoming resources that we'll be sharing, and have some time for some Q&A. And if you have any questions throughout today's event, please feel free to use the Q&A box to put your questions in, and we'll answer your questions at that time. And to introduce our speakers for today we'll hear from Aiko Schaefer, the Executive Director of Just Solutions, who has nearly 30 years of experience working on public policy issues and campaigns around the U.S. on poverty, inequality, women's rights, consumer protection, and environmental justice, in addition to state and federal partisan campaigns. We'll also hear from Sylvia, Senior Policy Analyst at Just Solutions, who focuses on federal policies and financing. Her role is to further policy innovation, foster peer learning, and help to build greater policy capacity for BIPOC frontline communities. And with that, I will turn it over to Aiko to get us started.
Thank you, Taylor, and thanks everyone for joining us on this webinar. I'm Aiko Schaefer, the Executive Director of Just Solutions, and I'm calling in from Amherst, Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts. So we wanted to start by just explaining a little bit about how this content came to be in context, sort of what we'll be doing next with it. So in the spring of 2024, a table of national organizations began meeting to compile their ideas of policy solutions given various potential election outcomes. We actually prepared for all of them, and we're really hoping that this was not the scenario that we would be presenting to everyone in terms of the impacts that you'll see and the potential consequences for communities. The table that we pulled together was intersectional, meaning that the policy experts come from a lot of different backgrounds. Some work on public health, immigration, immigrant rights, Indigenous issues, Indigenous rights. They work with a number of different networks around housing, CJA, a longtime leader in climate justice, others who've been leading the movement, the Green New Deal Network, Green Latino, so many more organizations that have brought together so much of their expertise, including funder collaboratives and other experts in this space. The information that we compiled, just to be clear, is not a policy advocacy agenda, but rather information for advocates to consider as they are developing their platforms and their work moving ahead in 2025. So next slide. So this is the list of all the participants. It is quite a lot of people who we're grateful for their expertise and time that came together to inform the work that we've been doing together. And so I know kind of small for everyone to really read. It's actually in the document that we'll be releasing next week. So what's next? This national table of policy experts will continue to collaborate and work together. We, as a group, meet at the intersection of climate justice and a lot of different issues. And so recently decided to call ourselves informally Climate Max, meeting at the intersection. For Just Solutions in this moment in 2025, as we move forward, the things that we will be doing is we'll continue to expand, staff, and facilitate the Climate Max table. We're going to build new legal capacity to be able to support communities on the ground and the broader objectives laid out in this document that Sylvia will be covering. We're going to dig in even deeper with states across the country as they continue to advance solutions. We're going to amp up our work around relevant and impactful research and analysis, and finally grow our educational programming, webinars like this, and other spaces of education, and work to include more people, included electeds, agencies, and staff. So with that, I will pass it over to Sylvia to give you all the details. And again, thank you all for being part of this conversation and part of this work with us today.
Hey, everyone. As I get started, I want to just let everyone know the slides will be shared with you. The report itself I believe we're also going to send out the report to everyone who registered. So if you don't catch something on the slide, because I tried to put a lot of stuff on the slides, you will get that as a reference. Okay, so I'm going to start off with just kind of setting some context as we are heading in. Well, now that we are fully in the Trump administration 2.0 reality, it's good for us to just set the context of like what we just saw in the Biden administration and what was the legacy from that. So I think probably everyone here is familiar, at least to some extent, with the Inflation Reduction Act. That was, in fact, the largest federal climate action that's ever been taken. And it rightfully gets a lot of acknowledgement and credit for being very significant in terms of its impacts. At the same time, I think it's just important to understand that the IRA, while it appropriated a good amount of money to a lot of different climate action programs and primarily grant programs, the vast majority of the IRA the spending is going to come through tax credits. And the way that tax credits work is that it depends on the market mechanisms and the ability of private sector, mainly actors, to use them. There is the caveat here is that the IRA introduced a new mechanism called direct pay or elective pay, which now allows nonprofits and governments to also use the tax credits. So that's a huge improvement, but at the same time, we also know that a lot of nonprofits and governments just don't have the capacity to do so because they're not used to accessing tax credits at the same time. So that's just to kind of set a little bit of background about like what was in the IRA. And I think it reflects the kind of broader Biden climate and energy approach, which was somewhat of an all of the above approach. There are a lot of subsidies for renewables, for example, through the tax credits and the IRA, as well as through the infrastructure law. But those laws also subsidized a lot of what in the environmental justice world we often call false solutions. So that would be like carbon capture, nuclear, some kinds of hydrogen. So there are there's a lot of support in those laws for those types of technologies as well. It's also important to know that it's really too soon to fully evaluate the impacts of both of these laws, especially as they're still a lot of the funding is still kind of rolling through the different the states and the other entities that are receiving the money. And then in addition to the IRA and IJA, the infrastructure law, there's been kind of less attention to this, but it's also important to keep in mind that the Biden administration did make a lot of great progress in terms of finalizing a lot of regulations, protective regulations and rules on polluters that address climate, as well as other kinds of like air and water pollution. These are a lot of rules under like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, et cetera, that had not been updated in a long time. And so it's really great that the Biden administration was able to update those rules with stricter standards than had been in place previously. But overall, kind of the big picture is that, while we're currently adding more renewables to the energy system, fossil fuels are still dominant and they're not declining yet overall in the United States. So the IRA and the other pieces of the Biden climate legacy are really significant, but they didn't transform the situation, and it is still inadequate to meet climate goals, just meaning that there's definitely more to be done. Next slide. Now that we have Trump in office and Republicans in control of both houses of Congress, I think a lot of people are asking, is the IRA doomed? And I think the short answer at this point is not entirely. And I think a big reason for that answer is that, as I mentioned, the vast majority of IRA spending is through tax credits, and the Republicans in Congress are not united in wanting to repeal the tax credits. And a big part of that is because a lot of the projects that are assisted by the tax credits are in their districts. So this map is E2's map of announced projects that are supported by IRA programs and tax credits. It's important to note that there's no really comprehensive set of available data on all these things. So this is not comprehensive, but it is illustrative. Just that there are a lot of projects that are like well distributed geographically, and there's a fair amount of them that are in Republican congressional districts. So that there's some kind of political capital built into that. In addition to the tax credits, which will be a fight that Congress will get to in the coming year, most of the grants from IRA have been obligated, and I'll go into a little more detail about what that means shortly. But as an example, a couple of the major sources in IRA of funding and financing that can support community-centered projects have been obligated, and that includes the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and the Environmental Justice Thriving Communities grant makers. Those are sources of funding that are out the door of the federal government and in other hands, and they will be continuing to distribute and make those funds available through grants or other kinds of financial assistance in the next few years. So those are still those programs are still functioning and available for folks to use. In addition to that, there are some other programs through IRA that were grants to states that have gone out. So there are some state program implementation opportunities depending on your state. Many states have planned for a Solar for All program, which is part of GGRF. So they will still be working on deploying that. There are also many states that have home energy rebates funding for those rebate programs that will still be rolling out. Next slide. Okay, so next I'm going to go through some of the kind of key threats to climate justice that we can expect to see from the Trump administration. And I'm going to start with the attacks on grantees, because I know this is something that a lot of people are concerned about and just have a lot of questions about. So focusing on the environmental justice block grants, there were $2.8 billion in IRA for these EJ grants. 2.2 billion got obligated before the change in administration. And obligated is a little confusing because a lot of the time, like the EPA or other agencies will announce funding, but it's not always clear like what that means. Often they will announce a selection of the award, which means they've decided who is going to get the grant, and then but that means they still have this step to go through of actually like finalizing the grant agreement, the contract that they're going to sign with the recipient. And then once they've like squared away those terms and conditions, those contracts, that gets obligated. So when those signed grant awards are done and obligated, they are legal agreements that are pretty durable. And so it's not the case that the federal government, the EPA, can just come in and like undo it. But there are still going to be it's possible that complying with the monitoring and compliance terms of those contracts may become more difficult under the Trump EPA. But we will see what happens with that. We do know that the Republicans in Congress have already been doing some attacks on some of these EJ grant recipients, and this really came to a head a few months ago when the House Energy and Commerce Committee released a report that was scrutinizing some of the recipients. So we can probably expect to see similar attacks in the future. So that would be, similarly other kinds of congressional investigations, audits from like the IRS, just a lot of inflammatory rhetoric we've already seen from some Republicans and other like right-wing commentators. If the IRS investigations and audits could also lead to threatening the nonprofit status of organizations, and then assets that are like in like bank accounts may be frozen as a result of some of these types of investigations. It's also possible that federal agencies can try to weaponize civil rights and immigration laws against organizations. Some examples that we've seen in the past include things like if an organization puts up like a job posting and they kind of mess up the wording on it so that it doesn't meet the letter of the law in terms of the civil rights and immigration laws, they can get in trouble for that. So it's those types of attacks. And at the same time, all of these factors come together to create this environment where state attorneys general and other actors will be emboldened to make similar attacks on their own right, on the same people. Next slide. Another key threat to climate justice under the Trump administration will be rollbacks under the Clean Air Act. So these are regulations that have been passed under the Clean Air Act that set standards on what different facilities, like factories, power plants, etc., like how much they can pollute. And this can be split up into two categories of both like climate pollution and then the conventional air pollutants. So we can expect that the Trump administration will try to revise the 2009 endangerment finding. This is a finding that EPA circulated that basically unlocks their ability to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. And then we know they're also interested in withdrawing, weakening, or delaying the 111B and D greenhouse gas standards for fossil fuel power plants. They will also likely want to do the same for the methane standards for the oil and gas sector. And they've also said they want to either deny or revoke California's waivers under the Clean Air Act. California has, since the beginning of the Federal Clean Air Act, California has had the ability to petition EPA to ask for these waivers that allow the state to impose more stringent regulations, standards for vehicles and some other categories. Basically because like grandfathering in, because California had a Clean Air Act before the federal one, and the federal government has granted this many times, and also many other states are able to sign on to it as well. So that's all to say that these waivers have a very large effect on the market of vehicles and other appliances that that this applies to. So this could have a really big impact in terms of climate pollution nationally. And then there's also a bunch of these conventional air pollutant rules that were updated during the Biden administration that provide a lot of protection to the communities that live near these polluting facilities. A lot of these rules already have some guardrails as a result of litigation contesting them. So it won't necessarily be the case that it'll be easy for the EPA, the Trump EPA, to gut these rules, but we can expect them to try, basically. Next slide. We also know that the Trump administration's agenda will be to basically supercharge fossil fuels and false solutions. So there will be, they're going to try to do expedited permitting for pipelines and extraction, especially on federal lands. They've also announced that they want to do quote unquote tax relief for fossil fuel companies. It's not clear exactly what that will mean yet. And then they also want to increase lease sales on federal lands, the outer continental shelf. They want to restart coal leasing, and they also want to restart LNG exports. One caveat to this is it's not clear that the oil and gas sector actually want to increase their extraction to the degree that the Trump administration wants them to. So we'll see what actually happens. But all in all, this adds up to increased health harming pollution and safety risks for the most vulnerable communities. This image is of the Satartia carbon dioxide pipeline explosion that happened a couple years ago as a demonstration of some of the risks that are likely to be amped up under the Trump administration. Next slide. Disaster recovery and resilience is going to be a big issue. Under the first Trump administration, we saw that they delayed, politicized, and ignored state requests for disaster aid. They deployed ICE to assist in recovery efforts, which had a chilling effect on having immigrant families and mixed status families in terms of seeking relief. And we also know that the experience in Puerto Rico with the recovery was suboptimal. They rebuilt the energy infrastructure to be centralized and fossil fuel based, as opposed to a more resilient and decentralized network of solar storage and microgrids, and which just left them with a less resilient energy system. In Trump 2.0, they have proposed in Project 2025 to shift disaster recovery to states by capping the federal cost share. And this is something that Trump just repeated in like an interview or something. So this is definitely still on the table. They also want to end and privatize the National Flood Insurance Program. They'll likely try to end, reduce, or weaken the FEMA and HUD grant programs for both recovery and preparation. They will likely try to reverse the updated energy code requirements for new housing construction that are assisted by HUD, USDA, or the VA. And then we've already started to see, even before he got into office, more politicization and the threat of placing conditions on disaster aid, and also the spread of disinformation that undercuts recovery efforts. So again, that adds up to more increased risks for the most vulnerable communities. Next slide. And then generally, we can also expect to see reduced agency funding and capacity. We will likely see deep cuts to EPA, Energy, Department of Interior, FEMA, HUD, and HHS. The weaponization of government and attacks on career agency staff, that's already happening. And that just, that adds up to little or no federal financial assistance or enforcement for environmental justice and energy equity priorities. We also, keeping an eye on like what DOGE is trying to do. They originally said they want to cut $2 trillion from the federal spending, which is pretty, if true, would be disastrous. But we'll see what actually happens. It's also good context to keep in mind that in the first Trump administration, the White House sought the total elimination of LIHEAP, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, the HUD Home Investments Partnerships Program, EPA Safe Water for Small and Disadvantaged Communities, DOE and the DOE Power Marketing Administrations. So these were all programs that they sought to eliminate in their budget requests, and Congress resisted that. So, which is all to say that like Congress still has a role here. And even though there is, a full Republican control of Congress, they may be able to be influenced to not totally go along with the Trump administration on some of these cuts, but we will see how effective that is. Next slide. A question that everyone asks, of course, is can he do that legally? In the Trump 1.0, the first administration, they frequently lost in court challenges to executive actions. So they only had a 23% validation rate, and it did not increase over time. But at the same time, the federal judiciary is pretty significantly transformed since the end of the first Trump administration. In the first Trump administration, they were able to confirm 234 Article 3 judges, including 54 on the courts of appeals and 3 justices on the Supreme Court. Biden was able to get similar numbers of Article 3 judges, but not as much on the Supreme Court. But I think it's still fair to say that the judicial landscape is significantly transformed and much more Trump friendly than it was before. So federal litigation seems less likely to yield lasting victories, but any delays that can happen from them can still be very helpful. Next slide. So just to kind of summarize and recap what we were just talking about, some of the key threats and their impacts are going to be more fossil fuels, increased production of and use of oil, gas, and coal, fast tracking these false solutions, especially nuclear, and also carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. Climate disaster resilience and recovery will be in a bad place. And then energy burden and affordability will probably not be advanced at the federal level. Next slide. So you've probably also seen some of the executive orders and other executive actions that the president has signed and announced in the past couple days. This slide has a list, just a partial list of some of the executive orders that relate to climate and climate justice. I think just the important thing to keep in mind is that the EOs themselves cannot change the law or regulations on their own. So a lot of them will say things like the agency heads should provide recommendations about whether they should revise the endangerment finding, for example. So it's not most of these are not going to be like self-executing. They're like multiple steps that a lot of these things have to go through to in terms of having actual impacts. So yeah, there's just kind of more steps to keep an eye out for. It's one thing to keep in mind about the Unleashing American Energy EO, which has gotten a fair amount of attention. It claims to, well, it claims to terminate the Green New Deal. So congratulations on us having passed the Green New Deal, apparently. But what they mean by that in the section is they say that they want to pause disbursements of funds that were appropriated under IRA and IJA. And that is something that like they can't do by themselves legally. So this could potentially be part of the Trump administration's plan to challenge the Impoundment Control Act. So as you might remember from, like civics class, it's usually Congress that controls the power of the purse, and the executive has to follow along with that. It has been Trump's position that that is unconstitutional, and that they plan to challenge that. So it might be the case that they will try to use this as their vehicle for challenging it and creating a constitutional crisis. So we'll see if they follow through with that. It's also, this EO is also the one that revokes the executive order that created the Justice 40 initiative. And then you may have seen there's a couple of other EOs that came out that basically terminate all the DEI and environmental justice programs. And there's a couple others that have to do with declaring an energy emergency and putting a pause on wind permitting. Next slide. Okay, so we have a couple of options of slides that describe some like actions you can take at the state and local level, and other actions that you can take to mitigate those threats at the federal level. Actually, can you go back one slide? Yes. So these are, this is not meant to be comprehensive. This is kind of meant to provide some options to spark your own ideas. And of course, we recognize that like in all states, there's just like a lot of variation in what's legally possible and what's politically possible. So obviously, these are not all going to work in every place. But some things to think about, and these are all things that have been done in various places. But some examples are under the category of strengthening state environmental protections, adding in incorporating consideration of water supply impacts and permitting for development. Also, a lot of states have different kinds of bans and restrictions on chemicals of concerns, including PFAS, certain kinds of pesticides, etc. Many states have a clean energy standard or renewable portfolio standard, which helps to move the grid towards a decarbonized grid. There are a few states a handful of states that have a state constitutional right to healthy environment. And I know there's several states where there has been consideration of creating a new green amendment to add that state constitutional right. There's a bunch of also kind of targeted equity policy solutions to consider that have been that folks have tried in different places. So there's the category of like procedural justice requirements, and that includes having like an EJ advisory committee, an intervenor compensation at public utility commissions, providing funding for community engagement just so that communities can take part in different kinds of decision making, passing a state funding set aside for EJ communities. So that would be kind of like a state Justice 40 program. And then funding for equitable clean energy deployment and resilience hubs, and then passing legislation for cumulative impacts or disparate impacts evaluations. So for local actions, local governments can do a lot with zoning and land use. So that could be adding environmental justice requirements to the planning process. There's a couple places in the country that have passed an amortization ordinance, which helps to phase out non-conforming uses. And then also like zoning code use restrictions that has been applied in various cities for pet coke and coal facilities and crude oil terminals, among other types of developments. There's a lot of different options that localities are looking at for building decarbonization. So these are just a couple examples. Building performance standards, and then variations on a heating oil tax, heat pump incentives, and weatherization funding are some examples of that. And then in terms of funding for community-led climate projects, and by that I mean things like community solar, community resilience hubs, and for example, in California, we have the solar and multifamily affordable housing program, those types of programs. There are still some funding and financing possibilities, like I mentioned earlier, from the federal government, like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and the EJ Thriving Communities Grantmakers Program. And then there's also some other options that we've seen in different localities, like in Portland, Oregon, where they have the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which is based on a gross receipts tax on big box stores, essentially. And then in Richmond, California, there was a settlement that they made with Chevron related to a refinery tax that they basically they threatened to put a refinery tax per barrel refinery tax on the ballot. And rather than seeing it go on the ballot, Chevron settled with them and offered them like 550 million over 10 years. So that is still early on, like they're still figuring out what they're going to do with that money. But that's another approach for finding funds to support these types of projects and priorities. Next slide. And then just a couple other areas to kind of keep an eye on and keep in mind. Litigation in the judiciary. I think a lot of the rollbacks of the regulations at the federal level are going to be covered by like the big greens with legal capacity like Earth Justice, Sierra Club, NRDC. But it's still probably worth looking into whether your organization needs to staff up in terms of getting legal counsel to advise on the risks to your own organizations, whether that is through like because you're receiving a grant or a sub-grant from the federal government, or if you think you might be at risk of just kind of those harassing attacks that the Republicans have been doing. So that's just something to keep in mind. There's also still a fair amount of, there are different ways that litigation can be used to fight against climate pollution in general, especially in state courts. And that could be through the public trust doctrine. There's a lot of public nuisance lawsuits that have been pretty successful against fossil fuel companies, greenwashing and deception, claims against different kinds of polluters, and also unfair competition. These are all like state court claims, and so like the laws will vary a lot from state to state in terms of how viable these strategies are. But overall, they have had some success in different places. And then I also just want to uh, just emphasize the importance of the state court judiciary in addition to the federal judiciary, and just making sure that we are able to get a fair hearing in state courts with good judges. In terms of federal government oversight, it's not the best situation because the Republicans are in control in both houses, but any members of Congress, even if they're in the minority, they can request investigations, audits, or legal opinions from the GAO, and that can turn up some useful information. They may also be able to request similar investigations from different agency inspectors general. They will still be able to, participate in committee hearings and investigations, but the majority is going to be setting the agendas for those, so there's not as much control over that. But it's still important for like when they do have, access to the microphone during these hearings for them to be effective in how they use their time. And then also just something that like everyone can do is, or try to do, is to help create media attention and public opposition, because we've seen in the first Trump administration that that can be an effective tactic in terms of getting the Trump administration to change what they're doing. And all of that is also to say that we need to focus on, or an important thing to keep in mind is just how we can lay the groundwork to change the conditions in Congress in the midterms. So I think that is the end of my presentation. Yeah, so we'll stop there and move to Q&A.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Sylvia, for that amazing presentation. That was really great. So much wonderful information. And if you have any questions, please feel free to use that Q&A box to start adding them in, and we can start going through them. So one question that I saw a couple of times is if you could explain more, what will be the expected impact of the EO overturning Justice 40? And someone also specifically asks, what does that mean when EO revokes EO 14008?
Yeah, so also I'm saying, yes, the slides and recording will be shared out to everyone. So the Unleashing American Energy EO, it has a bunch of different sections to it. One of the sections includes revoking basically all of the climate-related EOs from the Biden administration. 14008 was one of the EOs that Biden signed like on his first day in office, and it included the section that created Justice 40. And so the Justice 40 initiative, in case you're not familiar with it, is it was Biden's whole of government approach, and it was meant to ensure that 40% of the benefits of certain climate investments flow to low income and disadvantaged communities. And it set the goal of 40%. So I think there actually is like a fair amount of kind of like misunderstanding around that. A lot of people think that there's like a separate pot of money, of like Justice 40 money that is available, and that's not actually the case. So in a lot of these programs, the way it worked was like if you're a state who is applying for one of these covered programs to the federal government, You had to just explain in your application to the federal government how you were going to meet the Justice 40 goals. And then in other cases, there were some like grants, like through the DOE, the Department of Energy, implemented Justice 40 by saying that all of those grants that they administered, the applications had to include a community benefit plan. And then that community benefit plan would describe how benefits, 40% of the benefits would flow to disadvantaged communities. So um, now it's the case that uh, no, like none of the agencies are directed to try to meet that goal anymore. So going forward, there won't be any more of these attempts to try to meet that goal. But a lot of the grants that have already been obligated and the contracts have already been signed, they already incorporate those requirements in them to the extent that they are requirements. So it'll vary a lot in terms of like what the impact will be depending on the specific program.
Great, thank you. And then another question is, would zero NOx appliance standards for buildings that BA, AQMD, and CARB are proposing be allowed under the Clean Air Act with potential rollbacks?
That is a good question. I have not looked into this specifically. I believe those standards have already been approved at the like by the federal EPA. So I'm not sure what their ability is to like reverse that at this point. But that is that is something I have been wondering as well. So we can get back to you on that.
Great. And then there were a few questions about any advice or insights you can provide around what folks can do in red states, or even if you have recommendations for people who work at state agencies, how they might be able to lean into this work.
Um, I don't feel super competent to tell you about what can be done in red states. I'm based in California, don't have a ton of expertise and experience working in red states. But you know what I have seen is uh, that when, you know, for example, like when we have seen big economic investments in Republican districts, that that helps to defend against rollbacks. That's the idea. Because like if you have like, for example, um, like an EV battery factory in your district, you if you're a Republican member of Congress, you want to be able to point to that as you know, something that is creating jobs and prosperity in your district, and you don't want to get in the way of that. So those types of arguments tend to work in with Republicans, as far as I know. There's also you know, I've observed that there's been more Republican sympathy towards like blocking pipelines, for example, and other types of developments that could have impacts on private property. Those types of arguments tend to work with Republicans. But I think uh, another angle that is can be more tricky politically, but could also potentially pay off more, is trying to, you know, create a broader coalition that addresses the cost of living crisis and affordability crisis that everyone is facing, and you know, low income people and people of color are facing the worst. So in using that to address like energy affordability, for example. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's the best I can come up with.
That's great. Thank you. And then there are a few questions about how you envision the report being used. how I can support the work of the folks on the call. One question around like, does the report include actionable steps for implementation? Aiko, you mentioned that this will be more of a series of recommendations. If you want to go into a little bit about how you imagine the report being used, that could be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Great question. So yeah, lots to digest today. Sylvia and the table that we have did an extraordinary job of putting everything together, and a lot of bad news, but we hope some glimmers of pathways and opportunities to continue the movement building and work that we have to do. And I think Sylvia's focus on, really what we've been thinking about at the table is how do you build a more intersectional conversation, an intersectional strategy that begins to appeal to a broader base of people, and hoping that as you all are organizing in your communities or your place of work or whatever way that you have power and influence, that this document can be useful. So for us, the national table will continue to stay together. We're trying to figure out how to share information as we track what's unfolding and continuing to sort of stay on top of what's happening and what the options are. We're definitely looking at convening states as Just Solutions with our other partner groups that have state affiliates. So as you see the report, check out the list of organizations. If you're part of one, check in with that person. If you're not, we welcome you to reach out to us. We're happy to help strategize with you. There are some partners at our table that work with cities and municipalities. And again, we're also trying to figure out how we can connect more with existing spaces. Folks in the chat talked about governors. We've met with the National Council of Environmental Legislators, right? Just trying to be real about an all hands on deck moment. So the document is just a starter, and we hope you see it that way. And we encourage you to share it broadly with your members to facilitate a conversation and discussion about what you can do, and then staying in touch with us so that we can continue to share, lessons learned, replicating strategies, replicating policies, and being able to work more closely together. So it's just the beginning, more to come. So stay in touch with us. And again, find an organization on the list and plug in.
Great, thanks, Aiko. And then one more question for you, Sylvia. Can you clarify the information you shared around the Chevron settlement you brought up?
Yeah, sorry if I wasn't clear about that. So what happened was a couple of community groups in Richmond, which is in the Bay Area, it's a home to this really huge Chevron refinery. I think it's like the biggest on the West Coast. Anyways, these community groups basically came up with this idea to bring to the ballot a tax on the refinery that would have been like $1 per barrel of oil, the crude oil that they refine. And that they were ready to put this on the ballot. They had the city council on board and everything. And then Chevron, rather than risking losing at the ballot, they settled with the city and said, take that tax off of the ballot, and instead Chevron will pay the city $550 million over 10 years. And so now the city and the community groups are talking about figuring out what they're going to do with that money. But so I'm suggesting that like a similar approach can be taken in different communities where there's some kind of, if not a refinery, some other kind of like, large polluter, and see, what kind of leverage you might be able to have against them, in terms of like threatening to put on a similar type of tax, and then or otherwise if there's any type of leverage you can get against them, which might be able to result in a settlement, where you get a ton of money that you could potentially then use for climate projects.
Great, thank you. Well, before we jump off, I want to share some of the great, exciting things that are coming up. So, as we mentioned, our report, Defending and Advancing Climate Justice Policies, will be released next week. We will be sending that to all of your inbox, so you can expect that next week, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts and hearing how you use the report in your work. If there are any funders on the call, we will also be hosting a funder briefing sometime in the middle of February. So please feel free to reach out to us if you want some more information on that. And I know there were a few questions about how we can work together during this time. So, and share resources and information. So, in the next few months, we are launching our Just States newsletter, which I will put the link to in the chat to sign up for. I'll also share it in the follow-up resources. But this newsletter will be a way for you to get information on state level climate justice models, federal opportunities and threats, and hear some really great solutions from our partners. So please feel free to sign up for that. And lastly, I am going to put our post-event survey in the chat. Please let us know what you thought about today's event. Let us know what other topics you'd like to hear about, what are the resources we can help provide you in your advocacy. And we're really excited to keep doing this work with you all. And thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Aiko, for being here and sharing your expertise. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.